Are you at home right now wondering what is the perfect program I should be on? Look at this. I'm going to discuss with you what the perfect program is, and I'm going to go through all the different variables that make up that perfect program. And in case you're new here, I don't keep anything short. If you want to go and just get a short answer for what's the best way to build muscle in 60 seconds, head on over to TikTok and listen to some kid that's been training for 5 minutes. But if you actually want to understand some of this stuff, stick around. And I've broken it into 2 parts, so I'm going to keep it under 6 hours that way. But what are the variables I'm going to discuss? So after I get past this slide, we're going to discuss today is going to be part 1. Come back later for part 2. But part 1, I'm going to discuss what is the most important variable by far. That's coming on the next slide. Hang tight for that one. I'm going to go through things like frequency, number of exercises, exercise selection, and exercise sequence. Those are the main things we'll cover today. And don't worry, in part 2, we're going to get back to all these other things that everyone's concerned about. Proximity to failure, volume, rest time, rep ranges, intensifiers, and some things where we actually talk about making sure your program doesn't lend itself to imbalances, aside from individual balance issues that people have. And as we go through, I'm going to discuss what the winner is as far as programs go. Now, again, the next slide, I'm going to discuss this a little bit. I put winner in quotes because my experience lies with actually training human beings for 20 plus years, everybody from literally 90-year-olds, Gen Pop, up to Mr. and Miss Olympia. So having done all that and trained so many bodies, I know that there really isn't a perfect program for everyone. All that being said, I know what it's like to look at a new subject or a subject that maybe you're not a professional in from the outside. And sometimes people like me just go on and on and on about, well, everybody's different and it's all individual specific. And you're like, just tell me what to do. So this is as much as I can just tell you what to do, with a whole lot of little exceptions, thing to consider and all that. Because as soon as I also say, hey, here's the best program, then I'll hear in the comment section about every single little individual thing that people have got going on. So I'm going to try and do the impossible and balance this video so it helps everybody. But as we all know, that's impossible. So let's move on. What is by far the most important variable? And this really is true. It's really, if I look at every single person, just anecdotally, professionally, that I've had influence around, which is literally thousands of people. Before this was my job, I was just an obsessed meathead, little skinny kid, reading and watching everything I could about it. So I have a pretty good framework and data pool of people to look at when I say this. And really, how and why you do things is much more important than what you do. I mean, really, if it was like, there are literally little nerds at home, and I'm not picking on the nerds, I'm a nerd. I'll pick on the nerds, I'll pick on the meathead. I try and be a balance of both, but the extremes, I'm gonna pick on both of you. But there's some nerd at home that just sits around just like writing down every single variable that they possibly can, watches every single thing, reads every single study, and they weigh 130 pounds because they have the perfect program, but they don't want to work hard, they don't want to sweat too much. And that's why I really say that, again, what you do is the smaller part of it. How you do it and a couple of other things and why you do it are much more important. So I have this little thing here, kind of an analogy of adherence is king, work ethic is queen, and personal preference is some other important royalty analogy, like a prince or a princess, court jester, I don't know. They're very important, and that's maybe the order that it goes into. And why do I even say adherence is the most important? Again, the longer I've been doing this, you kind of hear people, if you're young and watching this, you're gonna say, yeah, adherence is king, blah, blah, whatever it is. But really it's, this is kind of why the meathead tends to beat the nerd. The super nerd kind of, and again, I'm not actually picking on people, I just have to say that. Everybody's so sensitive. This is just the extreme example. The nerd just tends to have paralysis by analysis, whereas the meathead just like, I'm gonna pick things up and put things down, and they're just passionate about it. The person that's in it for the long run, now the meathead can have other issues, all their joints might fall apart and they might feel like crap 30 years from now, but they're gonna look better than the nerd that is paralysis by analysis and start, stop. Snip, stop. And just is like, I'm gonna pick up another hobby that I can be a nerd about and never stick with it. So really, whatever helps you adhere and what really helps you in the long run, the reality is if you're consistent and you adhere for long periods of time, eventually you're gonna have some level of success. It's pretty much impossible not to if you're just staying in the game. And like I said, we'll talk about some other things because there really are big orthopedic exceptions that I'll have meatheads that they stay in the game doing they do the things they're passionate about with absolutely zero thought process, and they'll come to me 10, 15, 20 years later and literally like joints are disassembled and they're just trying to hang on to dear life. I just want to lift. And that's why you got to have balance as well too. So be a nerd, be a meathead, balance the two. That's the most important. And then we talk about other things like work ethic. So again, you got form, and then you have form when it matters most. Everybody's got pretty form on their warm-up sets, But when it's extremely heavy weight, it's extremely far in a set, getting very close to failure, form tends to go out the window. And again, you've got effort. And the effort is just that, again, how hard you're actually pushing. And this is a very tough thing to like label and say like a quantitative thing. But the reality is some people quit when things get hard. And so really form an effort going together when it matters most. Again, basically in working sets, towards the end of working sets. Those things right there really separate a ton of people. Again, you could have all these amazing, brilliant, beautiful programs that I'm going to try and outline here. But if you just don't get the basics of your form has to be good. I walk through normal gyms and everybody's really into programming variables, but the majority of people's form is just garbage. They just literally just change or modify their form to make things easier, to basically cheat, to avoid the range of motions where they're hardest. And then again, sometimes I literally see people just quit when I'm like, you really had like 5 or 6 or 7 reps left. People think, oh, I'm just gonna train with 1 or 2 reps in reserve. And in my opinion, they're training with like 8 reps in reserve. So all that brilliant programming aside, you have to train hard and you have to have good form and good effort when it matters. And then again, with work ethic, there's a whole host of things I could do, hours and hours of videos on everything to do with recovery, but outside the gym stuff, food, sleep, stress, that's work ethic as well too. This is like the most boring stuff. I can't do a ton of videos on how exciting or how cool this is. People are just trying to make up stuff just to make it sound interesting with food and all that kind of stuff. But that's work ethic, the boring stuff that you have to do that nobody wants to do, and you have to do it for long periods of time on end to have some sort of positive output. That's like a definition of work to me. So all of those things need to be in place for any of these next things I'm going to talk about to really even matter. And then preference is important as well too. Now again, I just put a little note here. My little handle is Hypertrophy Coach. My whole business is now predominantly about helping people build as much muscle as possible. So all these things are geared towards that. But if you're a human and watching this and not a hypertrophy robot, it's possible you have slightly different goals or you have more than one goal. And so it's like, hey, I want to be big, but I just kind of like maxing out every time I'm in the gym. So there's a lot of kids that want to be big, but they want to max their bench press, once a week or twice a week or something ridiculous like that. Is that good for hypertrophy? No. Is that something I constantly did when I was a teenager? Yes, because I liked it and it was fun. So you can do some stupid stuff and some smart stuff together as long as you know what the outcome is going to be. If you're going to max 3 times a week because you like it, it's not optimal or ideal for hypertrophy. It will slow down your progress. But if part of the reason you love the gym is because you love the experience of maxing out, you can balance those things. And I always have the example of murder prevention. People say when I walk through gyms, like, do you ever just see people and say, oh my gosh, their form is so horrible? Like, do you just judge them? And I said, I don't know what people are in there for. Some people are just in there just to grab stuff and to pick up stuff and to throw stuff and to just get their anger out on weights. And I'm happy they're there and not doing it out in public against me because they're angry and they're gonna grab me and they're gonna murder me. So some people I think are literally in the gym just to let out aggression, and that can be a great form of murder prevention. So I'm all for murder prevention being a goal as well too. So if you have some sort of hybrid hypertrophy murder prevention program, maybe I'll release that in the future, I'm all for it. So again, all this stuff is things I can't just skip past, I have to say, because these are important things, again, especially the longer you train, especially if you're a trainer or a coach, to be aware of this type of stuff. Moving on to some other stuff, almost to some other stuff. I have a note, again, I have to have a little preface here of evidence. So again, I'm designing this and going through this to say, okay, well, what is the most evidence-based or what is the perfect or the best program based on information that we have now? And I'm gonna kind of jump here, like really, I'm an evidence guy, but the evidence that I use the most is when I'm actually applying things. Now again, the tricky part with people using individual evidence is if you only train yourself, that's not very good evidence. If you've been a trainer for 5 minutes and you've trained 6 people, that's not great evidence. If your evidence is, I have a social media account and I look at other evidence-based coaches and I copy their stuff and I repeat their stuff and use that as evidence, that's not good evidence. But if you literally train thousands and thousands and thousands of people, that's a pretty good pool of evidence. And again, like I said, with a broad audience of people. So I love to use research as guardrails. That's what I think it should be used for. And then when all those guardrails funnel and have me actually apply stuff to human beings, that's the most evidence I look for. All that being said, there are some really brilliant evidence people out there that are more focused on research. Not more focused, but more focused than I am on research. Some of them train people as well too. That's all great. I probably left some people off. I honestly never think too long before I do these lists. I just kind of pull up on my phone and see who I'm following real quick and who pops up. So if you want people that are really more into the research than I am, for sure, they're actually reading papers start to finish, not just, again, the TikTok people that will read what someone else wrote about a study and reference that without actually reading the actual abstract of the study, not let alone the whole rest of the study, let alone not being qualified to actually review or say what the study actually says. We got Brad Schoenfield. When I wrote his name, it didn't have this little fancy little 2 dots over the O here. I don't really know what that's about, but you get a fancy Brad Schoenfield. My phone felt important to do that. Dr. Mike and Jared Feather. I put these together because I think they're a couple. Like, I don't know if like actually like romantically, I'm just kidding. But they're in a group kind of doing stuff together. I got Chris Beardsley, Paul Carter here as well too, same thing. I think they're a couple, just kidding, professionally a couple. And then I got Menno here, and I'm not even sure if I'm pronouncing his name right, sorry. But these guys are all doing great stuff, really into the research. A lot of them really put stuff together well. Like Brad's been doing it for a long time where he'll look at research and isn't one that's just gonna say, hey, here's the study that said this, and just, hey, you should change everything you do about your training, make this big 180 based on these papers. I like most of these guys because they'll literally look at research and try and have a lot of stuff really showing some things before they make any clear indications of this seems to be trending this way or that way, where again, some people will read a paper and say, hey, this proves this or that proves that. You really need a whole body of stuff to really support those guardrails, again, as opposed to just making 180s on stuff. And so just to clarify why I kind of jumped ahead, why am I not really a research guy? Well, one, to be honest, I don't like it and I'm not as good at it. Some of the research, you really have to be pretty sharp with physiology and chemistry. I'm really bad at chemistry. And to be honest, the combination, I don't know if it's, when I'm getting into the physiology stuff, full transparency, being honest here, I'll learn some stuff and I'll try and pay attention, but it's just uninteresting to me. So it'll go in one ear and out the other, and I just don't retain it because honestly, like my retention for things is when I'm training people and when I actually see things that I'm talking about actually applied to human body, it's more interesting to me. When I'm reading research papers, most of the time it just makes me want to like claw my eyeballs out. So again, there it is. I'm not that great at it. That's why I reference these people. Everybody's good at stuff. I'm more of a mechanics guy. I'm more of a in the gym actually training human beings guy. What's the other reason? Well, one is science, in my opinion. This research, in my opinion, is intended to help, not assault. A lot of people now basically use research as a weapon. So they go around the internet telling people how stupid they are because they don't keep up with normal research. I think it's especially hilarious when they just tell normal people that. Like somebody's just coming on real quick just to look at how to get a good bicep pump. They write something about it and somebody references something that's from a paper like 2 weeks ago and calling them an idiot. And I'm like, the guy just wants bigger biceps, chill. And so a lot of things, again, are used out of context. A lot of results of studies as well, too. And again, I say the science should be a process. It should be questioned. It should be used to help guide and direct. Again, it shouldn't be used to just like beat people up in the comment section now on social media. I also say this is a whole mess, which I could make a whole nother video about, but very often results are polarized. Results will say, hey, here's kind of the curve, here's the trend of what we see. There's always outliers on the curve, which are real people, and we can get some trends from it. But some people will say a study and say, oh, all of a sudden, this all the way good, and of course, the opposite all the way bad. And there's really no good research that says that in any way, shape, or form. The results will be sensationalized, taken out of context, and not actually think about how do we apply this to human beings. Or even worse, some people have, like, this is my thing, like, especially people in research, in my opinion, shouldn't really be known for a thing. Because then how are you not going to have, or at least have the attempt to have research try and twist it or manipulate it or look at it to kind of support your biases or ignore research that doesn't seem to line up with some of your stuff? And just to give some examples of some of that stuff is when I actually dig into research. So sometimes when I'm looking at research, I will look at the mechanics things within the research. And I will look at the variables of research. Just as a quick overview, like most people know what makes good research. And really good research is how well are the variables controlled. And so I think some people that look at variables will say, oh, well, we had everybody do the same form. We watched everybody perform the exercise. We watched whatever it is. And when I'm looking at things, especially from a mechanics standpoint, there's not a lot of really, really good research. There's just tons of things that I can go in and say, hey, this doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to me, or again, it's polarized. An example is going to be, there's a lot of length research now, and people will take things and try and make conclusions about a muscle length versus another muscle length without really controlling a bunch of variables to actually do just that. So again, the perfect example is, we'll have research that looks at a thrust versus a squat. And then people will say this is showing short glutes versus long glutes, which it doesn't. It shows a squat versus a thrust. Or if we're talking about, looking at a pressing motion and talking about triceps and trying to say this is again about long versus short with triceps. If you really wanted to control variables, you'd have to really control for range of motion. We'd have to define better what are these lengths that we're looking at and actually create some barriers. The biggest thing would we have to control for other things. It's not very intelligent to look at something like a squat and talk just about glutes when there's two other prime mover joints involved. End of the main joint, we're looking around hips. There's a whole lot of other musculature involved. And it's not very intelligent, in my opinion, when we don't control for joint torque. So very often we'll look at something that have completely different loading patterns. So again, they'll say, okay, well, you wouldn't do one study where we're looking at one where, hey, this person's going to do a 20-pound curl and this person's going to do a 40-pound curl. But so they'll compare exercises where there's completely different moment arms, which is really equates to loading pattern. So if we wanted to actually isolate something, we'd really have to look at things where we have control for moment arms and we have consistent torque through the range of motion. And that would have to be done realistically with a single joint. We'd have to divine the range of motion. We'd have to use circular cams so we know that we have significant or the same basically loading pattern. We don't have changing moment arms because that even changes with free weights, cables, and different shaped cams. And that's just a side rant to go into why some of this stuff doesn't actually say what it says, or if we're looking at supersets, or we're looking at proximity to failure, and we do compare like, hey, let's look at this entire workout done with straight sets and this entire workout done with supersets. And then we'll see that the straight sets work better, and we'll say, oh, well, supersets are stupid and straight sets should be the only thing that you ever do. When in reality, most people, those aren't the two options. What if someone's like, well, if I just want to do a superset at one point in time in my workout, even though most of it's straight sets. So again, side rant, but in my opinion, important rant needing to be addressed, where as much as I'm going to try and base this off of where research and literature is as guardrails, I'm also putting this all through the filter of actually applying this, programming with people, monitoring their results, and seeing what kind of results are actually produced, and trying to actually give you some guidelines based off of that, not just what some papers say. So next, we're actually getting into this stuff now. Woohoo, we made it. So let's talk about frequency. So the main goal of frequency, sum it all up right here, is train things as often as you can recover from them. So that really is the ideal, because at the end of the day, what we're looking to have happen after we train is protein synthesis. So we're actually having more contractile tissue, whether we're doing it, in sequence or side by side or whatever isn't really an important part. But at the end of the day, that's what we really want to have happen. So it makes sense where if we can do that more frequently, if we can have that happen for a body part, let's say for chest, if we can have it happen once every 3 days, or once every 6 days, once every 9 days, once every 12 days, what do you think would be more optimal? The more frequent, the better, because as soon as that process stops, then you basically do to a certain degree start to atrophy. So there has to be some degree of reasonable frequency to grow and at least to maintain tissue, and the more often we can do that, the better. And so really, the highest frequency you can recover from, the better. Now, the whole challenging point with all of that is really going to be managing fatigue that comes along with it. So there's a reason that we really just can't train every single day. One, depending on where you look, that protein synthesis thing maybe goes for 48, 72-ish hours. And again, there's always going to be some fatigue associated. Some of it's more short-term, some of it's a little more long-term. So that's really where all the balance of this comes in. So if we're looking really as just some examples of what type of programming, because this is what we're going to get to. I'm going to try and really say, hey, this is a program that seems to make the most sense, where we actually get into the split. So are we doing full body, half body, whatever, and then all the variables within that program as well too. So on paper, we'd have to say full body is definitively the best, because if you're doing full body, let's say 3 times a week, which is very common, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, then you're obviously having way better frequency than a bro split, where everything's only getting trained once per week. But there's other considerations. Like I said, we have to look at what we have within fatigue associated with individual session. We have to look at things like session duration. We have to look at the idea of physique balance, because again, sometimes depending on how we sequence things, which I'll kind of talk about here as well too, specifically with full body, half body, tends to be bigger movements first. So let's say we're doing something where even when we're looking at like a push-pull lower, where we're doing maybe push, it generally would go chest, and then it would go shoulders, and then it would go triceps. And even though that makes sense as far as prioritizing bigger movements, more taxing movements first, whatever's later in a session is always going to be deprioritized because it has more fatigue to deal with. You're just not going to have as much output, as much force production because of fatigue. So those are the other things that basically we have to balance. And so a couple of those things is, one, just the idea of most people don't want really long sessions. So that can be the challenge of full body. Now, full body can be great for some people if maybe they really only need to train, one exercise per body part, they're brand new. But for a lot of people that kind of want to fully train things, they don't want super long sessions. And then also they don't want the later movements to really suffer dramatically. So as we go through, like I said, I'm going to announce some winners on given variables. And then when we consider all the variables put together, we're going to try and find what's the winner based off of that. So hopefully we're just getting some context here, but looking purely at frequency, full body is the winner. But as we move into the next things, we'll see, well, okay, even though that's the winner, we do have some other considerations that come along with full body. Like I said, fatigues being the biggest one. Session duration is another one. The idea of having a hard time fully training a muscle group, and then also still having balance and not having body parts really lagging behind that are later in the session as a result of it. So after frequency, we're looking at the number of exercises. And so again, this kind of building off of that, what do I mean by fully training someone, not having excessive fatigue? Overall, this is the principle: the less exercises per session, the better. And that's just definitive fact. Now again, because if you just look and we take that example out to extreme, we're gonna have to, all of this stuff, you're gonna have to find some balance. I'm gonna give you some guidelines as far as the actual number of things, because people need numbers, but there's no clear cutoff for sure, right? But we do know if I could have a workout where it's okay, you've got 2 exercises to track and progress on over time, or you've got 20, even just practically, if you've ever worked out a day in your life, you'll know, well, it would be way easier to just have 2 as opposed to having 20, let alone how long it would take to do 20 exercises within a session. So basically, the more exercises you have, the more fatigue, and the less effective the exercises are later in the session. So with all of this and the number of exercises, one, the goal should always be efficiency. That's just, I can't see an argument why you wouldn't want efficiency. So the less number of things you can do to get the job done, so you have no unnecessary movements and no redundancy. This is where you look at people's programming and they might have, okay, I'm doing a flat bench press, then a flat dumbbell press, then I'm doing a flat machine press, then they're doing a flat fly. And essentially it's almost for, there might be some subtle differences there, but overall it's kind of for the same motions as far as your upper arm is concerned. And it could even have a very similar loading pattern if you're using all free weights or whatever it is. So we want to have no unnecessary anything, but we still want to ensure that we're fully training each muscle group. So we'll talk a little bit more in the next one when we actually get into exercise selection. Is there is this notion of fully trained. There is a reason that if we look over the course of someone's split, especially as they're a little bit more advanced, you might want more than 1 exercise per body part, and we'll get into that. But getting into some actual numbers, because people want to know this stuff, I would say the ideal would be 3 to 4 exercises per workout. And that's just with the notion of if you only have 3 or 4 exercises per body part, it's much more easy to progress that over time, and there's much less fatigue through the course of the session. So again, all of these exercises are going to be very, very effective. Again, compared to if you're doing 8, 9, 10 exercises, I don't care who you are, if you're training remotely hard at all, especially if you're training remotely close to proximity to failure or they're bigger movements earlier on, the later exercises are going to suffer. Now, realistically, this is where I said this might be the ideal. I think it's still very realistic and you can still make great progress if you do have to train maybe 6, 7 exercises per workout. But I wrote bro split somewhere, and bro split being the winner of anything is going to make somebody mad. But realistically, the way most people could do bro splits, if you have the idea of how do I fully train a muscle, lots of muscles, you don't need more than 2 exercises, sometimes arguably even 1. And even some of the bigger muscle groups that maybe have a little bit more broad origins, they're a little bit more complex, they have different fibers you can bias, you really don't ever need more than 2 or 3 tops. So again, if we're doing a bro split and you're training chest, there's no human being on earth that needs more than 3 or 4 exercises to fully train their chest. So that's all I mean by if we're looking purely at the number of exercises associated with a split, that's why I have bro split as a winner. Now, before that, we put frequency. I would say that's probably more important. And as we'll go through, you'll see there's ways that we can modify the other splits so that we still fully train things and have higher frequency as well too. So relax, I wrote winner bro split. Nobody freak out. Don't write me any hate mail, nerds. So exercise, we're going to discuss both of these, exercise selection and sequence. So in case you're new here, if you're not new here, you've heard me talk about this stuff a whole bunch, but I think these are the most important things basically for the idea of exercise selection. So first and foremost, alignment. Now, alignment is arguably important for making sure we're biasing the right fiber. So if you're trying to get your upper chest fibers and you're doing this decline motion, that's a kind of extreme but obvious example. That's really not gonna do it, right? And so there's kind of a whole range of making sure that we're hitting the tissue we're trying to hit. But more importantly is really for orthopedic health. And this is why this is a good thing that's happening more in the industry now, in my opinion, is there's less notion of these have to do exercises. Previously, people were like, you have to bench, you have to deadlift, you have to squat. And now we realize even if we're looking at those patterns, or even more importantly, looking at the trained joint and muscle, we realize we have a whole lot of options where we don't necessarily have to do those things, and we can be orthopedically feeling way better. So if someone doesn't feel good doing back squats for whatever reason, and they feel exponentially better doing a hack squat, and their goal is to have huge quads, that's a perfect example of, oh, that might feel orthopedically way easier on their back, where back squats just constantly give them back pain or whatever it is. So for exercise selection, alignment is really king before anything else. From their profile, so there's a whole lot of discussion right now, which I honestly think, in retrospect, is going to seem extremely silly. But the simple thing of profile should be, look at what you're capable of doing, look at the muscles involved in any motion. So pick an exercise, we look at a curl, we look at a press, you have to standardize where the line of force is, because a press where it's a dumbbell straight up and down and a converging press are not the same things. But look at what your body's capable of doing and ideally match that with the loading pattern of the exercise. Now again, Things like understanding internal moment arms and leverage are very important. The problem with that is that's just part of what makes up your perception of strength on things. So some of it, again, depends on the loading pattern of the exercise, where the line of force is for the exercise. Some of it also depends on internal stuff. Internal stuff is not just leverages or internal moment arms. It's also that length tension thing. It also is the size of the muscle groups that are involved in various motions. But the good thing is I'm going to say here is this is not me. I'm not touting myself, but my main mentor, Tom Purvis, is the only person on the planet I would argue that is really, really testing this well. Other people have done it, but it's not hard to go through and kind of positionally see what someone's capable of doing. And for any motion, you will find there's drastically different force production capabilities through the range of motion. And so again, a perfect example is you don't have to super nerd. Now again, Tom's figuring this out. I shouldn't say it's easy. It's somewhat easy. To do it very, very well is not easy. If you see how Tom is actually doing, he's the only person that's actually really engineering all the things you need to do to really accurately test it. But all I mean by that is if we test anyone on the plane of what they're capable of doing for a row, every single person is drastically stronger out here and drastically weaker back here. So again, ideally for a rowing motion, you would want something that goes from really heavy to lighter. It doesn't have to be perfect, but the idea is you want to avoid doing the opposite. You wouldn't want something that's super duper light here and really heavy here, at least with the idea of optimum. So that's my little rant on profiles. There's a lot of people talking about lengths and this and that and matching and leverages. And at the end of the day, someone's already solved this better than everyone else out there. That's still, a lot of people out there are doing checkers. They're looking at one piece at a time. But if you're doing chess, playing chess like Tom Purvis and looking at the whole thing, he's solving it. He's already solving it better than anyone else out there. So a little side rant on that is my millions of side rants here. Then from there is bracing complexity. And that basically just means you want to choose exercises that you can progressive overload forever. So one, if something is, I'm balancing on a Bosu ball while doing a curl, the complexity of that is going to limit your ability to progressive overload on time, aside from the fact that force is just distributed everywhere. It's not really efficient for those reasons. But then also another example would be like, doing like a standing cable fly. It's realistically, if you want to be giant and strong, eventually, if you get to the point where you can do, 50s each side, 100 each side, 150 each side, eventually it's literally going to just Spider-Man. You're just going to pull up the load of it's going to be more than exceeds your body weight, and that's going to become much more of a challenge, where if you just were on a bench and you didn't have to balance this back and forth thing, that would be better exercise selection. So that's really what's meant by bracing, and I kind of lump a whole lot of things in complexity. But again, you just don't want stuff kind of distributed everywhere, or to have to balance circuit stuff. Some nerds that don't know anything have taken that out of context and say this is why a Smith machine is definitively better than a barbell press, for example. That's not what I'm talking about. It's that those subtle differences don't make drastic differences in exercise selection. It's the extreme stuff that we really want to avoid, and that's very individual dependent. And then there's this notion too for exercise selection of how do we fully train something. So there's two ideas in my opinion of really what makes something fully trained. One is, did we load near its full contractile range? So if we understand every single muscle in the body that we're trying to train, what does that look like fully lengthened? What does that look like fully shortened? And did we kind of closely fully train that? And I do think that there's a lot of reasons that is something for most of the time, for most people, you should easily do within your programming. And despite there being a ton of focus on the lengthened range, particularly in my opinion, should be the mid to lengthened range, there's no really reason not to train the shortened range of motion as well too. And we know that you can grow muscle there, so I don't really see the point of excluding it altogether. And the notion of when we have muscles with broad origins, then there is this notion of, are we biasing the different tissues? So all I'm saying is for chest, it's a perfect example. We have some clavicular fibers that go this way. We have some costal fibers that go that way. That's a very big difference. So it's as simple as, okay, maybe you have one thing that's a little bit more flatty decline to bias these, and then we have one thing that's more tucky pressy to bias these. It doesn't mean 47 different angles, but within your chest workout, I don't think there's anything wrong with maybe one pressy this way, one pressy this way. And then again, if we're looking at range of motion, could be like a fly or something where maybe we're overloading the short. And that'd be an example of, even though that has a little bit of a broader origin, that's a little bit more complex than maybe something like a quad. Like I just did there, you don't need more than 3 exercises still. So we do have this idea of we want to fully train things. And as you get more advanced, I think that's a good thing to do. And then we also want sequencing as well too. So how do we sequence, or how do we prioritize that exercise selection? So again, if we're saying, okay, we have different exercises that train different ranges of motion, they train biased different tissue, how do we sequence that? In my opinion, you do want to prioritize things, and prioritize means just put earlier in the sessions things that overload muscles mid to lengthened range. And again, I think that's just with the matter of efficiency. And again, especially if we're looking at this length tension thing, I think it's hard to get away from this notion of where do you produce the most intramuscular force. And again, intramuscular force is separate of this leverage thing or this internal moment arm thing. Once we've already decided, our body has decided what muscles we're using. Yes, the leverage thing has a big impact on which muscle are we going to prioritize to move this joint. But once that's already selected, that's basically completely separate of length tension. So that's why we can't neglect that as well too. And like I said, this is still not a huge deal. Going back to slide 1, don't take things I said out of context. A perfect example of this would be glutes. So if I have a person that says, I want giant glutes, and especially if someone gets more advanced, this is why I might put a thrust earlier in a session. Because even though maybe a squat variation overloads the mid to length range of the glutes better, it also generally trains a whole bunch of other muscles. It's not necessarily as efficient. And when someone's top idea is, I just want my glutes to be bigger, then it can be a great idea to isolate the glutes in one of the few exercises that really do, and take the other muscles out of it, maybe if they don't want bigger adductors or they don't want bigger quads. So even though this is a general template of things to follow, that's just one example of where it's still perfectly fine to train something in the short first if it works better for the individual, because obviously going back to that example of the squat versus the thrust, we know that you can grow a ton of muscle in the mid to shortened range for every muscle. It's not just a squat thing, or it's not just a thrust thing or a glute thing. And so again, we know this, like I said, all muscle groups for sure can produce hypertrophy. So again, I don't really see most of the time a reason to eliminate them. Again, maybe with the exception of someone that's brand new. If you're only choosing one exercise, so again, using another example, if we're looking at quads, for a brand new person, I'm only going to put one exercise on their program. If I'm going to do a squat or a leg extension, I would tend to choose a squat or quad dominant squat variation, because again, that overloads the mid to lengthen range. But for most all other people, you should train a muscle through its near full contractile range. Just prioritize the mid and lengthen range. So why do I have the winner here as the bro split or even the push pull lower? Because in general, with a push-pull lower or bro split, it's very easy to fully train every muscle while still saying the exercise constraints of you don't want more than 6 or 7 exercises, right? So for a more advanced person that wants to train the full contractile range of a muscle, and we want to cover all those, broad origins and all that kind of stuff, it's really, really tough to do on a full body program, at least if we're looking within one session. Now I'm going to get to the next stuff. There are ways, of course, that we can modify things like half body or full body to try and make sure that, again, it doesn't all have to happen in one session. But if we're looking just at one session, that's why the winner here is either a bro split or something more like a push-pull lower. Moving on, part 1 recap. So again, that's kind of the main things that we're going over here. And I'm gonna pull this all together. You probably already saw it right there. Winner, half body. He really didn't even talk about half body. How can I say that half body is really the winner? Well, let me get to it. Thank you for asking. So really this all comes down to balancing. So it's balancing what are the things we want. We want high frequency, but we want minimal fatigue, and we still want to fully train each muscle group while having a balanced physique. So how do we do all that together? Well, the two extremes, in my opinion, don't work ideally. So bro and full, kind of like, hey, bye-bye. Now again, there's still plenty of times that those they both still work. And there's definitely individual goals where they work. Remember slide 1, don't yell at me for saying that. But again, if I'm talking to most of my demographic and most of my population, intermediate to advanced, here's why I think half body can be an epic program option, or push pull lower can be. So I'm gonna kind of say for prioritizing body parts, I do tend to actually slightly prefer push pull lower, or what people would call a modified push pull lower. Because really, if you do want to prioritize a body part, and that's fine, you don't need to have somebody tell you when that's important. Like, you got to train for 10 years before you prioritize anything. That's not true. You don't have to watch yourself having really crappy arms for 10 years before you're like, oh man, I need to put 4 inches on my arms for it to match everything else. No, again, I get the idea that when you're a beginner, don't worry about it because you have no muscle to know what you need to prioritize. But after a few years, if you're noticing imbalances, I think things like a push-pull lower can be a great option because you can still have very high frequency for especially things you're trying to bring up, and still have decent frequency for everything else as well too. But if you have a balanced physique where it's like, I just kind of want to grow everything as fast as I can possibly grow it, I think the most effective split is going to be a half body split. And so what does that look like for a normal person? Because for almost every normal person with a normal schedule, it's very easy to train everything in your body twice during a week. So most people will do that, or twice during a 6-day period of time. So the average way that I have people do that would be, upper, lower, off, and then repeat. Now that's 6 days. Now, if you're an absolute freak of nature and your recovery is a 10 out of 10, and depending on some other variables, of course, in theory, you could do that 3 times within a week, upper, lower, upper, lower, upper, lower, off on Sunday. Again, generally that's just for the robots. The people that maybe have not a whole lot else going on in life, can sleep 12 hours a night and eat perfectly and low stress. But for other people, they'll be kind of somewhere in the middle there as well too. And so again, that's why I tend to like that, because it allows for very high frequency. But there's still ways to optimize it. So what can still be the issues? You said, Joe, all right, well, how do I kind of optimize this program? You said I still have issues of minimizing fatigue and making sure that you're fully training every muscle group. And so one, to make sure that you're fully training, to fully train something, realize it doesn't have to be done within one session, right? So that's, I think, one of the biggest misconceptions. If you're saying, okay, well, how the heck do I have something where, I've got 3 exercises for chest, because Joe said that would be good. Maybe you have 2 different ones for lats. If we really start to add that stuff up, you're like, well, how the heck do I keep less than 6 or 7 exercises per workout? That's really where it comes into having an A-B rotation. An A-B rotation meaning if I have upper and upper, you have 2 different upper workouts within one go through of your split, basically. So in one upper, you maybe have 1 or 2 chest exercises, and then the other one you have 1 or 2 different chest exercises. So over the course of your program, you can still fully train the muscle. You can still prioritize that mid to length and range, because you don't feel the need or the constraint to all get it done within one session. Now, you're gonna say, Joe, but you said that the optimal or the ideal is to only have 3 or 4 exercises per session. And I honestly still stand by that. That's based off personal and professional experience, where if I have someone doing, let's say, a workout that is 7 exercises, and if I actually look, what's really the test here is how well did they, in short term, how well did they progressive overload? How do they progressive overload the fastest on all exercises? And in turn, how does their physique progress the fastest? Is if I break a session up. So if I have somebody that has a half body split and they have 7 exercises on a given day, if they have the time available, if they do maybe 3 or 4 exercises in the morning, take a few hour break, get some meals, take a nap, whatever it is, and go train again in the evening, they're gonna have less fatigue to deal with for the second half of the workout, right? Because some of that fatigue is relatively short term. So again, if I do 4 exercises and then I have to do the 3 exercises immediately after, there's fatigue there. So those 3 aren't gonna be quite as much stimulus, gonna be able to produce quite as much force as if I have several hours for my body to deal with some of that fatigue before coming back to the next session. Now again, probably most of you watching this are like, thanks, Joe, that's not helpful. That's not helpful for me either. I'm just throwing it out there. My schedule does not allow that in any way, shape, or form. But I wrote here, College Joe's schedule, that worked great for. And honestly, there's been various times when I've had for myself or clients when their life essentially revolves around this, or they've got a lot of free time, where if they can do that, I say, go ahead and do it. Because in my opinion, 1, you can still do the A-B rotation, but 2, separating those out, that really answers all the questions of how do I fully train something and how do I have very minimal fatigue, is break those sessions up. And when I've actually had people do this, they're generally, it's crazy the difference. Now again, how do I actually test this and compare instead of just talking about it? I have people do both, and if we look at those last 3 movements, when done together or when done separate, the progress that people make on those last 3 movements, again, just putting a number on an example, is way faster, and the progress their physique makes is way faster as well too. So again, like I said here, don't cry. I'm not saying you have to do that. If you do all 6 or 7 in the same workout, it's still a great workout. It still allows for very high frequency. The A-B rotation still allows you to kind of fully train every muscle. You're just gonna have maybe arguably a little less effective than it could be if you separated out those sessions. So that's my idea of probably one of the most absolutely optimized split. And that's again, just kind of the overview of the actual split and how I would structure it. Would be a half body, it would be an A-B rotation, and it would come with the option of you could do it as 2 days and not just 1 session. So come back for part 2, and I'm gonna discuss, again, more things you can modify. So there are some other issues that I mentioned briefly, is almost no matter what, even whatever you're training first in the day, even if you're doing 2 days, does get prioritized even a little bit more than what's getting trained in the second. So there are still actually more ways where, again, if you're like me, anytime I did half body, full body, or even push pull lower, my extremities, unless you have great genetics for arms, calves, delts, things like that, they tend to lag behind. And while those programs always work great for me, I tend to just kind of look like a refrigerator where all of my torso muscles will get big and my not fantastic arms just stayed exponentially not fantastic. But there are ways that you can actually program to prevent that from happening as well too, even within a half body program. We'll discuss that next in part 2 as well. And then I'll discuss all the other things actually within the workout. So we kind of just went through why I would set up a split, why I would pick half body, how I would kind of do an A, B, and sequence stuff. And then we'll actually look into volume sets, rest time, rep ranges, intensifiers, and again, how do you keep that balanced physique, which is what I was really talking about as far as, how can you modify things so those extremities don't get left behind. And I know what you're thinking. If you're like me, you're like, man, that sounds amazing, but you just said a whole bunch of stuff and I don't know how to actually put any of that together. Don't worry. I got it for you. I have an epic program, the Optimized Hardcore Half Body. Is that a cool name? I don't know. I'm combining optimized so the nerds are happy and hardcore so the meatheads are happy, and it's a half body program. And this program addresses all of those things. So not just the sequence, but the other things I haven't even talked about yet, all the ins and outs of it. And you can be the first to access to it. I've got a link just for you guys, just for YouTube down below, where you can join a wait list, because this program drops on Black Friday. So if you actually get on that wait list, you'll actually get it before anyone else can get it. Not only will you get that program, but you'll get 25 full programs that are already on there, the diet planner, hundreds of hours of educational content, one-on-one support in the forums. I answer questions in the forum, give you audio replies. You can logbook these programs within the app and much more. And like I said, if you put your email down below, that's all the link is. It takes you to putting in your email, and I will send you an email as soon as these programs drop. And also, you will by far get it for the cheapest prices of the entire year. I always do that on Black Friday. If you're watching this, and it's like 2 years after I filmed this, and you're like, what the heck, I missed the boat. Sorry, I'll put another link down there where you can still go access the program and the app and all that other awesome stuff that's on there. So hope you guys enjoyed this one. Come back for part 2. Yes, I'm trying to sell you something. I do have kids to feed. I do make a living. Like most people, if there's a baker that makes awesome cakes, they don't just tell you how awesome they are and then don't want you to eat it. They try and sell it, all right? So I think my program is awesome, and I think you would love it and you get great results. I'm gonna try and sell it to you too, so chill out. But if you don't want to be sold anything, then enjoy all that free stuff. Come back for part 2, and you can do the whole putting together yourself and still have a very epic program. Maybe you could even put something together more awesome than mine. But until the next one, click the link, give me your email, get some muscles, get some deals, and all that good stuff.